We are reading the Sherwood Ring by Elizabeth Marie Pope. Okay, we're starting on chapter 1, but it's page 9, and we're going to go through page 29, I believe. Hang on, let me double check. Yeah, through 28. So we'll start the new chapter on 29. So, okay. Hang on, get myself situated. How he did it, I never knew. But 10 minutes later, the train had stopped, and I, with my overnight case, was scrambling out onto the loading platform that stood by the tracks in Tatlock's hayfield. From the platform, the remains of what had once been a wagon road sloped up the field to a gap in the low stone wall. The gap in turn led onto a country road that rambled away over the hill, hand in hand with a noisy little brook. It had stopped raining, but the sky was still overhung with scudding dark clouds, and all the ruts were full of water. I went by 2 more fields and a pasture where an old white horse turned his head to look after me. Then the country lifted and became wilder and more overgrown. The low stone walls disappeared or lay tumbled up under clustering masses of blackberry and woodbine. The brook was lost in thickets of young trees. Presently, leaves closed in about the road. Branches began to meet overhead, and I found myself in a wood, or rather something that looked like a forgotten corner of the original forest. Huge elms and maples and mountainous oaks that must have been old when the first Enos Graham was young. They were so dense that it was impossible to see more than a foot or 2 into the tangle on either side, and even where I stood it was almost dark. I began to walk a little more quickly. It was getting late, and a ground mist had begun to rise from the dripping forest and was blowing vaporously across the road. Then the road suddenly came to an end. It was like a bad dream. One moment the road was there. The next it had split into 2 separate roads, one going off into the trees on the right and the other going off into the trees on the left. There was no signpost and no possible way of telling which branch led to Rest and Be Thankful. I came to a dead stop between the 2, wondering frantically what on earth I was to do now. My hair was wet and my feet were wet, and the overnight case was beginning to drag heavily on my arm. I tried to fling back my head bravely, but the gesture only brushed an overhanging branch and sent a shower of cold spray down the back of my neck. It was darker than ever under the trees, and I was sure that it would only be a matter of time before it started to rain again. "Can I help you?" said a voice over my shoulder. "Have you lost your way?" There behind me, apparently sprung out of nowhere, was a girl about my own age sitting side saddle on a tall black horse. She was wrapped in a long crimson raincoat with a hood that was pulled down over her hair and shadowed her face. But even in the dim light and the mist, I could see that it was a beautiful face, dark, proud, with wide-set gray eyes that were brilliant as jewels. It did flash through my mind that she was rather curiously dressed, and it was strange that I had not heard the horse's hooves coming up behind me on the road. But at the moment, all I could really think was that here at last was somebody who might be able to help me, to tell me how to get out of the wood. "Can I help you?" the girl asked again. "Oh yes, please, if you will," I answered gratefully. "I'm trying to walk to Rest and Be Thankful." "Oh, I don't know what turn I ought to take here." The girl bent her head and sat for a moment as if she were considering something. Then she looked up, and tucking back a dark curl that was blowing out of her hood, she lifted her riding crop and pointed with it to the road on the left. A little past the first bend in that direction, she said, you will come upon a young man repairing a small car which is broken down. I am sure that he would be glad to tell you the way to Rest and Be Thankful if you asked him. And without another word, she touched her mount with her heel and went off down the road on the right. In another instant, both she and the black horse had melted into the depths of the wood as noiselessly as shadows. Then, as I stood rigid where she had left me, staring after her, utterly mystified, I realized that in spite of her strange appearance and behavior, she had been right about one thing at least. There was somebody down the road to the left. Through the sighing of the wind and the mournful drip of the branches, I could hear a sharp clinking noise as one piece of metal struck another, and above it, faint but unmistakable, a man whistling a little tune. It was a catchy, swaggering air like an old ballad, and it came dancing through the uncanny silences and shadows of the wood as comfortably as an outstretched hand. I followed the sounds a little past the first bend of the road, and there, just as the girl on the horse had said, was a small and very shaky-looking old Ford in obvious difficulties. The hood was raised, and the whistler, a tall, fair young man with his shirt sleeves rolled up, was bending over the engine, doing something with a wrench and an oil can. The engine shuddered indignantly, and then apparently lost consciousness again. "Behave yourself, Betsy," said the young man in a severe voice. "Drink your nice oil, or—" He caught sight of me and straightened up with a jerk. "Good Lord, a human being!" he exclaimed. "Where did you come from?" "I beg your pardon," he added apologetically, "but I haven't seen anybody for so long that you took me by surprise." "But didn't a girl in red go by you just a few minutes ago?" I asked. "She must have passed you. A girl in red, riding a black horse." The young man laughed and shook his head. "No, neither she nor yet a Maharaja on a jeweled elephant," she said cheerfully. "There hasn't been anybody at all. What's the matter? Were you looking for her?" "No, I just happened to meet her down the road. I was trying to get to a place called Rest and Be Thankful, and she thought that you could help me the way. Tell me the way." "No, I just happened to meet her down the road, and I was trying to get to a place called Rest and Be Thankful, and she thought that you could tell me the way." "Now that I can do," said the young man. "I'm trying to get there myself, as a matter of fact. Unless Ted Lowry at the garage has played me false, it ought to be about a mile from here, straight ahead. But mayn't I give you a lift? I know your mother probably told you never to accept rides from questionable strangers, but I happen to be the dull, trustworthy type, and while I haven't my Boy Scout merit badges or my letter from the vicar in my pocket just at the moment—" "But I think I must have heard about you already," I interrupted. "Aren't you the professor from England who rented Ted Lowry's car and is boarding at Mrs. Dykeman's?" "England, yes. Professor, no. At least not for about another 20 years, said the young man. "It's nice to know that that's the way I impress people. But to tell the truth, I'm just a student over here on a scholarship to do some research on your War of Independence. My name is Thorne. Most of my friends call me Pat. Mine is Graham, Peggy Graham. Mr. Graham at Rest and Be Thankful is my uncle." "He is?" The young man's eyes lit up. "Miss Graham, I don't want to seem impertinent or intrusive, but would you mind very much if I asked you something? It's just that I can't understand the situation at all, and the fact is, good Lord, I'm keeping you waiting in the mud. Here, get in the car and put this over you. I think it's probably the original buffalo robe Ted Lowry's grandfather used when he went out courting in his cutter, but it may help to keep you warm. What were you going to say the fact was? I asked, spreading the buffalo robe across my knees. That's the trouble. I don't know. Pat had returned to the engine and was poking at it rather savagely. The whole business makes no sense at all. Did you ever read one of those mysteries where the heroine leaves her mother at the hotel for a few hours while she goes out to see the strange city? And when she comes back, the mother has disappeared and the room has been furnished, and all employees swear themselves blue that they never laid eyes on her before? I always used to think it was a silly sort of story myself, but now I'm not so sure. You mean you left your mother in a hotel and... Heavens no. Only that's been happening to me and just a little too much like that story to be funny. Listen, I told you I was a student over here on a scholarship, didn't I? Well, I got it to do a history of guerrilla warfare in New York during the Revolution. I was particularly keen on the idea because one of the 18th century thorns was with the British Army, and it was supposed to have been involved with the guerrillas in some way. I remember an old cousin of mine telling me about him once when I was a boy down at the family place on a holiday. He showed me his picture and a great pack of his letters and the diary he'd kept while he was serving in America. I didn't actually read them myself at the time. I couldn't have been more than 10, but I saw them. That I am certain of. Certain. But why shouldn't you be? That's just the point. When I heard about the scholarship, naturally the first thing I thought of was laying my hands on that stuff. It was original source material, you see, that had never been published, and since my cousin had said that the 18th century Thorne was a rather remarkable man, it might very well turn out to be really important. My cousin had died that winter, and I had inherited the place, but a sister of his who'd kept house for him was still living there. So I went down for a week before I sailed to say goodbye and make arrangements for taking the papers with me. And would you believe it, Cousin Mildred simply looked me in the eye and said her poor brother must have been making up bedtime stories to amuse me. There wasn't any picture. There wasn't any diary. There weren't any letters. There hadn't even been any 18th century Thorne who'd fought in the War of Independence. And she would thank me to be a little more quiet and stop pestering her about it. No such person had ever existed, and the sooner I got that through my head, the better it would be for all concerned. The worst of it was that as far as I could tell, she was quite right. You mean you weren't able to find anything? Anything at all? Not a trace, not a whiff, not a scrap. And it wasn't as if I didn't take the house apart practically brick by brick looking for the stuff either. There was just one hint I found that kept me from feeling I must be completely mad. The picture I told you about was only a little thing, one of those miniatures painted on ivory with a round gold frame. And my cousin had hung it on the wall beside the desk in his study. By the time I got there, it was gone, like all the rest, of course, and big Victorian watercolor of Salisbury Cathedral at sunset was hanging in its place. But underneath, there was a little round dark patch on the wallpaper, just the shape and size of the miniature as I remembered it. Something of the kind had certainly been there for years. Wait a minute. I think Betsy's coming out of her tantrum. He drew down the hood of the car with great care, as if he were afraid of disturbing somebody, and slid cautiously under the wheel. Betsy coughed once or twice in a fretful way and began to snuffle forward. What did your cousin Mildred say when you told her about finding the place for the miniature? She said that if I thought I could hold her accountable for every spot on the wallpaper, I was mistaken, and her sainted mother had painted the watercolor of Salisbury Cathedral at sunset with her own hands, and it was very fortunate she wasn't back on Earth today to see what the manners of the younger generation had come to. At that point, I gave up. My ship was due to sail in a couple of days, and I decided I might as well let the whole Mildred problem wait till I saw what I could find at this end. My late cousin had said something about 18th century thorns being connected in some way with the Grahams at Rest and Be Thankful. I'd remembered the name because it was so odd, and I thought your uncle might be able to help me out. I particularly wanted to get in touch with him anyway, because everybody had told me that he was the authority on local history in Orange County, and couldn't be kinder or more gracious about letting young scholars consult him and work with his collections. Kind and generous, those were the exact words. Pat scowled furiously, and Betsy, apparently taking his expression as a personal insult, let out a squeal and collapsed again. But what happened? I demanded, when we were moving once more. I don't know, I'll tell you. It was the business with Cousin Mildred all over again, only worse. I wrote him politely when I got in, enclosing my letters of introduction and asking when it would be convenient for me to call. He didn't answer. I wrote him again, and he still didn't answer. I tried telephoning, but the operator says he doesn't have a telephone. Finally, I decided that the only thing left to do was drive out and make one last effort to see him myself. Not that I expect this will work, but look here, Miss Graham, what's the matter with me? What's wrong? Do you happen to know if I've done anything to offend your uncle? Or is this just the way he usually behaves? I was obliged to tell him that I had no more idea than he had of the way Uncle Enos usually behaved, but added soothingly that there had probably been some simple misunderstanding, and everything would be cleared up as soon as we got to Rest and Be Thankful. I certainly hope so, said Pat gloomily. I'm beginning to feel like one of those characters who's under a mysterious family curse. The sun's coming out again anyway, I went on. Maybe it's a good omen. The woods seem to be getting thinner, too, and, oh look there! The last of the trees had fallen away behind us, and the road was dipping down into a little valley that lay between two curving hills, a valley full of apple trees, all in full bloom. Immense, straggling apple trees, the largest and oldest I had ever seen. Where the two hills met, there rose suddenly from the drifts of delicate flowers, as if it were some enchanted sea, the mossy, dark roof of a huge stone house. There were 4 enormous chimneys, 2 at each of the main gables, and between them, along the ridgepole, perched 3 white pigeons, sunning themselves after the rain. Below, there were glimpses through the foaming branches of weathered stone walls and dark shutters. I had never been in a place that looked so quiet, so utterly hushed. No one was in sight. Not a leaf stirred, or a voice broke the golden stillness that lay like a spell over everything. Even the pigeons on the roof sat without cooing or preening, and the afternoon light gleaming on their motionless feathers. So that was why they called it Rest and Be Thankful, I murmured. For some reason, I did not feel as if I ought to raise my voice. Betsy seems to think so too. Anyway, said Pat ruefully, she's stopping again. This time Betsy had apparently settled down for a long nap, and it proved impossible to rouse her. In the end, Pat took my overnight case, and we walked down the driveway under the apple trees and on through a velvet-like formal garden to the house. There, 4 steps led up to a flagged terrace with a balustrade and great urns heaped with trailing ivy and rose geranium. You know, I'm inclined to think that poor Betsy was just trying to be tactful, said Pat, glancing up at the fanlight and fluted white columns of the doorway. This isn't the kind of setting where she looks her best. We really ought to be arriving in the coach and 4, with outriders and powdered footmen up behind. At that moment the door opened, and a very old butler with white hair bowed to me, saying something in a voice which shook so that I could only distinguish the words, "Miss Peggy," and "come in," and a great day for the house. Behind him was a wide, shadowy hall with a grandfather clock that ticked loudly in the stillness, and a huge fireplace with a trophy of guns and swords over the mantel. At the back, a vast mahogany staircase went up into the gloom. "Mr. Enos is in the study," said the old butler, opening a door at the right. "He's been expecting you." We passed into a dim, paneled library with high bookcases that reached to the ceiling, and across it to another door on the far side. My heart was beginning to beat thunderously, and my feet kept stumbling over each other. I glanced frantically around for Pat, but he only caught my eye and winked at me outrageously. "Miss Peggy, sir," said the butler. Uncle Enos was sitting in a high-backed wing chair by the fire. I recognized him instantly. Very tall, very dark, very slender, with what we called the Graham face. Long and narrow, the thin, straight black eyebrows over wide-set gray eyes, like my father's and my own. But my father had never stood so erect, or carried himself with such overwhelming dignity. Now, when Uncle Enos came forward and held out his hand to me, it was almost as if he were tossing a ruffle of lace back from his wrist. "My dear child," he said magnificently. He sounded so like a character in the 18th century novel that I felt I really ought to sink down into a deep curtsy and ask him for his blessing. As it was, I merely found myself touching his hand for a brief instant and murmuring something about being glad to see him. Uncle Enos, in return, expressed a polite hope that I had not had too long or difficult a journey. "But I see," he added, "that you were traveling with friends?" And his eyes went inquiringly at Pat, standing near the door. Pat set down the overnight case and took a determined step forward. My name is Thorne, sir," he said clearly, "and I have been very eager to meet you for a long time now." I had wondered what was going to happen when Pat and Uncle Enos finally came together, but not even in my wildest speculations had I hit upon the sort of thing that actually occurred. Uncle Enos stared at him for one stupefied instant, and then said in the most appalling voice, "You!" "Why, yes, I suppose so," said poor Pat, utterly taken aback. "You remember that I wrote you some time ago for information in connection with my study of guerrilla warfare in Orange County during the..." Uncle Enos merely drew himself up in front of his desk, as if he were bodily trying to protect its contents from the contamination of Pat's glance. "I have nothing whatever to say to you, sir," he interrupted him in a voice of ice. You will leave this house at once." And with that, he actually stretched out his arm and pointed his finger at the door, exactly like the outraged father in an old steel engraving called Her Tory Lover that I remembered hanging on the wall of Mrs. Campbell's inn parlor. "Uncle Enos, please." I clutched at his other arm desperately. "Please, don't you understand? This gentleman has been very kind to me. Be quiet, child." Uncle Enos had made a fierce gesture with his hand. "Let me deal with this. I don't know how he contrived to make your acquaintance, but you are never to have anything to do with him again. Never. Do you hear me?" "But why, Uncle Enos? Why? What is it? What is he supposed to have done?" "Yes, if you don't mind, sir, what am I supposed to have done?" Pat cut in. "Look, Mr. Graham, I'm sure that there must be some mistake. If you'll only explain—" "I have no explanation to offer you, now or on any further occasion," announced Uncle Enos grandly. "I have told you to leave my house, and I have told my niece she is not to see you again. That is enough for you both. I refuse to discuss the subject any further." He flung back his head, standing very straight, one hand at his hip as if he were resting on the hilt of a sword. He looked more like an 18th century gentleman than ever. But Pat was beginning to lose his own temper and looked rather like an 18th century gentleman himself. The haughty young officer in Her Tory Lover, in fact. He did not rage or stamp or shout. He simply allowed his gaze to rest on Uncle Enos as if he were seeing him from somewhere a long way off, and did not find him particularly attractive. "In that case, sir," he retorted, "I think there is nothing more I have to say to you, except perhaps—" He turned with his hand on the knob of the door and grinned at Uncle Enos impertinently. "That I have every intention of seeing your niece again, very soon, whether you like it or not." Then he was gone. As the door swung shut behind him, Uncle Enos suddenly began to shake. He caught rather fumblingly at the back of his desk chair and sank down into it, almost as though he could not bear to stand. Almost as though he could no longer stand. As the door swung shut behind him, Uncle Enos suddenly began to shake. He caught rather fumblingly at the back of his desk chair and sank down into it, almost as though he could no longer stand. "What shall I do now?" he whispered. "What on earth shall I do?" He was speaking to himself. Apparently he did not even realize that I was still in the room, and his face looked so white and miserable that I could not help going to him and putting a hand on his shoulder. "Dear Uncle Enos," I begged, "can't you possibly tell me what's the matter?" But Uncle Enos was already recovering himself. He twitched his shoulder away from my touch and pulled his chair around to the desk, turning his back on me altogether. "I thought I told you I was not going to discuss the subject." He reached for his pen and letter pad with an impatient jerk. Run along now, like a good child, and don't bother me. I have work to do. If you'll just go back to the hall and speak to the butler, he'll take you up to your room." The butler, however, had gone away, and there was nobody in the hall when I came out but a maid winding the grandfather clock. A very pretty girl in a long, full-skirted dress of flowered chintz with a ruffled cap and an organdie apron. She told me her name was Petunia, and she was the downstairs maid at Rest and Be Thankful. She had an older sister, Xenia, who attended to the upstairs, and a younger sister, Gladiola, who helped the cook in the kitchen. All three were daughters of the butler, Christopher VII, so called because he was descended from the original Christopher, who had been butler in the days of the first Enos Graham and had died in 1792, leaving a son, Christopher II, and a grandson, Christopher III, to carry on the line. The present Christopher was the seventh and the last of the family. And Mr. Enos has gone and got him so stuck up about that name that he won't even let his own children call him Daddy no more, concluded Petunia with a disrespectful giggle. Did you say you wanted to go up to your room now, Miss Peggy? Dinner won't be till 7 o'clock if you'd like to lie down for a while first. You must be mighty tired after all that trip. Suddenly I realized that I was tired, cruelly tired, so tired that it seemed a long way across the hall to the stairs. The strain and excitement and confusion of the afternoon, had worn me out completely. Everything that had happened was whirling and jumbling incoherently through my mind. The walk through Martin's woods, the mysterious girl on the horse, and Pat and the curious story he had told me. My glimpse of Rest and Be Thankful among the apple trees, the scene in the study when Uncle Enos had so strangely refused to have anything more to do with Pat and had driven him out of the house. Maybe it will get clearer tomorrow, I thought, foggily as I trailed behind Petunia up the stairs. Anyway, I can ask Uncle Enos about the girl on the horse. She must live somewhere around here. He probably knows who she is. But as it turned out, I did not have to ask Uncle Enos after all. The next moment, I had come around the bend of the stair into the landing, and there, gleaming down from the paneled wall, hung a great life-size portrait in a carved and gilded frame. It was the portrait of a girl wearing a long crimson cloak, a beautiful girl, dark and proud, with wide-set gray eyes that were brilliant as jewels. One of her hands rested on the shoulder of a tall black horse, just visible behind her in the shadows. The other hand was lifted to tuck back a dark curl that was blowing out of her hood. On the frame under the picture was a small square plaque with the inscription, Barbara Graham, at the age of 16, painted by John Singleton Copley, 1773. I stood staring at the portrait for a long time before I could get it through my head that I had already met my first ghost at Rest and Be Thankful.